we'd like to think that seeing is believing, but it's just not. Like as humans, we tend to see what we want to see and believe what we've already decided is true. And so just all those dynamics mean that it's so tricky to try and engage people around issues because you've got to take all of that into account. There's all these other things that mean we're not just approaching it like a computer would approach, solving a mathematical problem. And then yet deep down, I think we have this baked in idea that humans are essentially reasonable. And if you just give them enough evidence, enough logic, enough good reasons, eventually they'll see the light and change their mind. And that's just not how the way it rolls.
Yeah, no, it's not how it rolls. There was a lot of rationalization. Same example, same group. I'll never forget. There was an event we were at that we were securing, and one of the Nation of Islam guys, was letting people in for money without checking them, which is extremely dangerous because we're frisking for weapons, and he's letting people get in who don't want to get frisked for weapons. Why do you think they don't want to get frisked for weapons? Sure, maybe they wanted to skip the line, but probably they wanted to bring in their weapons. And I confronted him about this, and he went off on this weird tangent about how George Bush fed crack to the black community. 9/11 was an inside job, therefore he needs to make money. And I was like, what? What are you even talking about right now? And I thought, oh, he's mentally unstable. Like, this is just nonsense rambling. Surely no one else here will agree with that because you can't really follow that. There's no logic. So I brought it to other people, and I was like, can you keep an eye on him? He said this and this and this. And then he's like, oh, well, he's right about that. And I was just like, oh, so they've been fed that story from somewhere else, and they use it to rationalize. Like, that was just like a thing they probably met about at one of their meetings or something. So then they all use that to rationalize theft and doing dangerous things or putting the whole team in a dangerous situation. And they ended up all getting fired because, of course, I told the head of the company that we're letting in weapons so this guy can make an extra $20 an hour or whatever. And he was like, okay, well, that's not going to work. It's just so weird. The rationalization is wild. It's like we can really do anything. We don't just look, I'm as guilty as anyone else. I move the scale. I try to pee a little bit more and make sure I'm not wearing anything. Maybe like do some sort of weird ritual and step back on the scale, hoping for a different number. Yeah. And it's never happened, but I still do it every single time anyway.
Yeah.
But you're right. We like to imagine that making decisions or being convinced of something is like this logical, linear process, but essentially we just make a decision based on what our intuition or our gut or whatever we want, the desired outcome. And then our brains, I think you wrote it in the book, something like they play the role of attorney. They rationalize whatever conclusion we've already jumped to in the first place.
Yeah. I think what I wanted to look at in the book too is this notion of what are the two different parts of our brain that it's almost like two operating systems that we work with in any given day, in any given moment. And the reality is we do have that part of our brain that is logical and rational and reasonable. And so I refer to it as our inquiring mind. It lives at the front of our brains, that frontal lobe, the most recent part of our brains to develop from an evolutionary standpoint. And it's really good at nuance and complexity and being reasonable. Problem is it takes a lot of energy, a lot of self-discipline to use. And so we just don't use it anywhere near as much as we'd like to think we do. So Zoe Chance, who's a researcher at Yale, so she'd suggest that part of our brain, that inquiry mind part, we only use for 5 to 10% of our decision-making and our perception formation. So where's the rest of our thinking happen? So it's in a part of our brain I refer to as our instinctive mind. So the instinctive mind is in that, if you want to look at the geography, like where does it live? It's in that sort of the limbic system part of the brain. So near the top of the brain stem, it's where we process emotion. It's where our tribal instincts live. It's where our fight and flight impulses tend to reside. And the problem with our instinctive mind is that it's super fast. It's very efficient, but it's prone to jumping to conclusions. And therefore it comes with so many of those, the classical term is heuristics or shortcuts that we use as humans. But it also doesn't just rely on what's coming as a brain impulse. It actually is incredibly sensitive to things like our gut. Like the brain-gut connection thing is fascinating.
Yeah, do you know much about that?
Our gut, the little bit that I looked at in the book, I'm like, this is a whole other thing. Yeah. So I'll probably come back to that in the next book, I think, because I think it's still really new as well. Like we're still discovering exactly how the gut works, like how some of those vagal nerves, those parts of our gut that do the thinking, how they interact with our brain. But also it feeds into sort of like bigger and almost metaphysical questions like where does the soul live? Where is consciousness? Right. That idea of like we're not just brains roaming around in a body. Like there's something about, when you walk into a room or a conversation, you're like, I've got a gut feel for this. There's an intuitive sense that I sort of know what's going on because somehow I've picked up on stuff that I can't logically make sense of, but it's data I need to pay attention to. And so I think, our instinctive mind, we'd be silly to dismiss it and go like it's unreliable, it's impulsive, it's prejudiced and all the rest of it, because it can be those things, but actually often it's taking a very wide frame of view in terms of what's happening around us. And so typically we make the decision with our instinctive mind and then we look to our inquiry mind to back it up. That's when logic and evidence does play a role, but it's only to reinforce what our instinctive mind has already decided to be true. And so that's a tricky thing. If you're going to change someone's mind, the question is like, which mind are you trying to change? Because in most cases, stubbornness resides in the instinctive mind. And you look at most government campaigns, most health campaigns, most of our conversations when you're trying to influence someone, you're using the tools that speak to the inquiry mind. You're using data and evidence and pie charts and rational reasons, but that's not the mind you need to change. And so it's like, how do you speak to that instinctive mind? That's the challenge.
I also noticed that a lot of like the most persuasive fake news is often the stuff that persuasive is probably the wrong word. The most effective fake news is the stuff that is highly emotional and that you can use as a cudgel against somebody else. Like you might see an ad. Here's an online conversation, and I'm making these numbers up, right? 73% of Republicans believe that you shouldn't have a choice when to have a child, and then the reply to that is, "Oh yeah, well the Democrats sacrifice babies," and it's like both of those things are probably BS, but one of those things is making the other side look horrible and is enraging zealots and things like that. And the other one is just like a number. Even if it is a number, again, that I made up, right? And it is phrased in a certain way. And you can't really, it's hard to get around that. So people write in all the time and they're like, how do I convince my uncle that baby trafficking for organs is not a problem you have to worry about in Ohio? And I'm like, you probably can't, right? Because a lot of what appears to be stubbornness or arrogance, it boils down to us just not knowing how decisions are made and how people are convinced. But also, if somebody's just bought in whole hog on something like that, you can't, what's that phrase? Like you can't logic your way out of something that you've emotioned yourself into, or it's like if you convince yourself emotionally of something, you can't reason your way out of it. It only works in one direction.
That's exactly it. Like you can't reason someone out of a position they didn't arrive at by reason. Like they got there in a really different way. And so, I mean, that example is interesting. And I think this is where, sadly, the levers that get pulled in fake news, but also just mainstream media on both sides or any part of the continuum ideologically, typically we play to the things that the instinctive mind's like junk food for the instinctive mind. Like what does the instinctive mind love? Tribalism. It's me versus you. Simplistic binary narratives. It loves outrage. It loves fear because fear triggers that like we've got to do something quickly, we've got to react. And so nuanced discussions, complexity doesn't really speak to the instinctive mind necessarily well. It can be a good primer for reflection, and we'll probably get to that at some point. But like, interestingly, in fact, one of the problems we see with the climate change debate, and I heard this put recently, the problem with climate change isn't that it's happening too fast, it's that it's happening too slowly. Because the problem is our instinctive minds are only wired to react to concrete, tangible, immediate threats. Mm-hmm. So if something is vague and nuanced and slow and hard to pin down, our instinctive minds basically don't pay any attention to it. And so you tend to see like those sorts of messages appeal to those instinctive mind, fear, outrage. We've got to defend ourselves and fight against an enemy. And in many cases, the enemy doesn't even exist. It's a figment of our imagination. I think starting with imagination is a useful one. So if you look at an issue like abortion, so depending on where you are on the spectrum, like what do you imagine the opposing side to be like? And typically they're really silly imagined things.
Yeah, they
so
are.
like you've got one side imagining you've got all these uncaring white politicians who have no sense of what it's like to be a parent in need, have no compassion. I'm like, there might be some who are like that, but I bet there's a lot who aren't. And a lot of those who are really committed to like not allowing abortions easily. They give to charities, they care, like they're actually not evil people. But by the same token, you see people on that side of the equation who've got imaginations of the sort of people who fight for abortion rights that are way off reality. Yeah. Like they're actually just not like that. And so this is where I think coming together and hopefully meeting each other in the middle getting a sense that like the 2D trap, that idea of demonizing or deifying, like you are awesome and perfect and flawless, or you are enemy and the scum and a band of deplorables. Like when we label those things, it feeds into those binary narratives. It's not a reflection of reality, and it means we don't think well. And yet, again, mainstream media can play to that really well. And over time, it does so much damage to society because it speaks to all of our worst impulses as humans.